The cruelest kind of heartbreak isn't being left behind. It's being humiliated while everyone watches. The soft glow of crystal chandeliers spilled across the grand ballroom of the Riverside Crown Hotel in downtown Chicago, casting golden reflections over polished marble floors and rows of elegantly dressed guests. Laughter floated through the air, mixing with the soft notes of a string quartet playing near the stage. Champagne glasses sparkled beneath the lights. Expensive suits, designer gowns, smiling faces. To everyone else, it looked like the perfect engagement celebration. But for Claire Bennett, standing near the center of the room in a navy blue dress she had spent 3 months saving for, something felt wrong. Her fingers tightened around the stem of her champagne flute as her eyes searched the crowd. Ryan Brooks had disappeared nearly 20 minutes ago. The man she was supposed to marry in less than 3 months. The man she had supported through years of building his startup. The man she believed she would spend the rest of her life with. Claire forced herself to smile as guests offered congratulations. Her cheeks hurt from pretending. Then the music suddenly faded. Conversations softened. Heads began turning toward the stage. Claire looked up just as Ryan stepped into the spotlight. Relief rushed through her chest. Maybe he was preparing a surprise speech. Maybe she had been worrying for nothing. Ryan adjusted the microphone and flashed the confident smile that had once made her fall in love with him. "Thank you all for being here tonight," he said. Applause followed. Claire smiled. Then Ryan extended his hand toward someone standing offstage. A young blonde woman emerged from the crowd wearing a silver dress that shimmered beneath the lights. Claire's smile froze. The room grew strangely quiet. Ryan wrapped an arm around the woman's waist. "There's something I need to be honest about," he announced. Murmurs spread across the ballroom. Claire felt her heartbeat stumble. "For a long time, I convinced myself that loyalty was enough," Ryan continued. "But eventually you realize you deserve someone who matches your ambition, your future, and the life you want to build." Claire's stomach dropped. Guests exchanged uneasy glances. Some looked away. Others stared openly. Ryan's eyes landed on Claire. "I'm sorry," he said, though there was no sorrow in his voice. "But this engagement is over." The words hit harder than any scream could have. Claire stood motionless. The glass in her hand trembled. Around her, hundreds of eyes locked onto her face. Ryan turned toward the blonde woman beside him. "This is Vanessa, the woman I should have been with all along." A few shocked gasps echoed through the ballroom. Claire felt heat rush into her cheeks. Her ears rang. For a second she thought she might collapse. But she didn't. She remained standing. Ryan laughed softly into the microphone. "Sometimes people stay in your life longer than they should because you're too afraid to admit you've outgrown them." The silence became unbearable. Claire swallowed hard. Every instinct told her to run, to disappear before the tears arrived. But she refused to give him that satisfaction. She lifted her chin and stared at him. Across the room, unnoticed by everyone, a tall man in a black tailored suit watched the scene unfold from a corner table. His gray eyes narrowed slightly. Unlike everyone else, he wasn't looking at Ryan. He was watching Claire. Watching the woman who had just had her heart shattered in front of an entire ballroom, and somehow was still standing. For a moment, nobody moved. The ballroom seemed trapped inside a strange silence that felt heavier than any noise. Claire could feel hundreds of eyes on her, waiting for her to break, waiting for tears, waiting for humiliation to finish its cruel performance. Ryan stood confidently beneath the spotlight with Vanessa at his side, already acting as though the last 4 years of Claire's life had never existed. Claire slowly set her champagne glass on a nearby table. Her fingers were steady. That surprised even her. Inside, her heart felt as if it had fallen through ice, but she refused to let anyone see it. She took a single step backward, then another. She was preparing to leave when Ryan spoke again. "Claire," he said into the microphone, "do not look so shocked. We both knew this was not working." A few uncomfortable laughs escaped from scattered corners of the room. Claire felt her stomach twist. Ryan smiled as though he was the victim. "You are a good person," he continued. "But sometimes good is not enough." The words landed like stones. Claire remembered helping him pack boxes during the first months of his business. She remembered working extra shifts so he could invest more money into his company. She remembered believing every promise he had ever made. Good was not enough. The sentence echoed inside her head. She opened her mouth, wanting to say something, anything, but the lump in her throat refused to move. Then a chair scraped softly across the floor. The sound was small, yet somehow it cut through the tension. Several guests turned. A tall man rose from a table near the back of the ballroom. His black suit fit perfectly. His posture was calm, confident, familiar to some of the executives in attendance, though Claire did not recognize him. He walked forward without hesitation. One step, then another. The crowd instinctively moved aside. Ryan frowned. "Sir?" he asked, clearly annoyed by the interruption. The man ignored him completely. His attention remained fixed on Claire. As he approached, Claire noticed the calm expression in his gray eyes. There was no pity there, no amusement, no judgment, just quiet certainty. He stopped beside her, close enough for her to hear him lower his voice. "Do you trust me for 30 seconds?" he asked. Claire blinked. Of all the things she expected tonight, a stranger asking that question was not one of them. "What?" she whispered. 30 seconds, he repeated gently. "That is all I need." Her mind raced. Nothing about the situation made sense. Yet somehow his voice felt steady in the middle of the storm. Ryan looked increasingly irritated. "Excuse me," he called from the stage. "This is a private matter." The stranger finally glanced toward him. The look lasted barely a second, but something in it caused Ryan's confidence to falter. The ballroom grew silent again. Claire could hear the faint hum of the air conditioning, the distant clink of silverware from another room. Her own heartbeat. Then the stranger extended his hand toward her. "My name is Alexander Hayes," he said. "And if you let me help, tonight will not end the way he planned." Claire stared at the offered hand. She had never heard that name before. She had no idea that several executives in the room had suddenly gone pale. She had no idea why whispers were spreading through the crowd. All she knew was that the worst night of her life had somehow become even more unexpected. Claire stared at Alexander's hand while uncertainty battled exhaustion inside her chest. 30 seconds. It sounded absurd. Then again, nothing about this night had followed reason. Around her, whispers continued spreading through the ballroom. A few executives exchanged nervous looks. One woman near the front nearly dropped her champagne glass after hearing Alexander introduce himself. Claire noticed none of it. She only saw a stranger offering her a lifeline when everyone else had stood by and watched her drown. Slowly, she placed her hand in his. Alexander's expression softened almost imperceptibly. Then he turned toward the stage. Ryan forced a laugh into the microphone. "I think there has been some misunderstanding here." His voice no longer carried the same confidence. Alexander ignored him. Instead, he gently stepped beside Claire, positioning himself between her and the crowd as if shielding her from hundreds of curious eyes. "Tonight was supposed to be special," Ryan continued, attempting to regain control. "I would appreciate it if uninvited guests stopped interrupting." Several people shifted uncomfortably. The tension was becoming impossible to ignore. Alexander finally looked at him. "You are right," he said calmly. "A night like this should be special." The room fell silent again. Ryan smiled awkwardly. "Exactly, which makes what you just did even more disappointing." A ripple moved through the audience. Ryan's smile disappeared. Claire blinked. She could not understand why this stranger was standing up for her. He did not know her. He owed her nothing. Yet every word seemed deliberate. Every movement seemed effortless. Ryan tightened his grip on the microphone. "This is none of your business." Alexander glanced toward Claire before speaking. The moment someone chooses to humiliate another person in front of a room full of people, it becomes everyone's business. A few guests lowered their eyes. Others nodded quietly. Ryan's face reddened. Vanessa looked increasingly uncomfortable beside him. Claire felt emotion rising in her throat. Not because Ryan had hurt her. That damage was already done. But because someone had finally said what nobody else was willing to say. For the first time all evening, she did not feel completely alone. Alexander took another step forward. "A person's value is not determined by how useful they are to your ambitions." The words hung in the air. Ryan opened his mouth, but no response came. Across the ballroom, phones had begun appearing. Guests were recording, capturing every second. Alexander looked back at Claire. His voice lowered enough that only she could hear. "Trust me." Before she could respond, he gently reached down and picked something up from the floor near the stage. Claire's breath caught. It was her engagement ring. She had not even realized it had fallen during the chaos. Alexander examined it briefly before closing his hand around it. Then he looked directly at Ryan. You were willing to throw away more than a ring tonight. Ryan stood frozen. The silence stretched. Then, to everyone's surprise, Alexander returned to Claire's side. His hand settled lightly against her shoulder. Not possessive, not performative, simply reassuring. The cameras continued recording. The crowd watched. Claire felt her pulse racing. She had no idea what was about to happen next. But judging from the stunned expressions around the room, neither did anyone else. The air inside the ballroom felt charged, as if the entire evening had paused and was waiting for someone to decide how the story would end. Claire could feel dozens of cameras pointed in their direction now. Guests whispered behind raised glasses. Several reporters who had been invited to cover Ryan's company launch were already moving closer. Ryan looked from Alexander to Claire and back again. The control he had enjoyed only minutes earlier was slipping away. "I think this has gone far enough," Ryan said sharply. "Claire and I have personal matters to settle." Claire almost laughed at the word personal. There had been nothing personal about being discarded in front of hundreds of people. Alexander remained calm. "Then perhaps you should have handled it privately." More murmurs swept through the crowd. Ryan's jaw tightened. Vanessa shifted uneasily beside him, clearly regretting becoming part of the spectacle. Claire wished she could disappear. She wanted fresh air, silence, a chance to process the disaster her life had become in less than 10 minutes. Yet somehow Alexander's presence made standing there easier. Not because he was solving her problems, because he was reminding her she did not deserve what had happened. The distinction mattered. Alexander slowly opened his hand and looked at the engagement ring resting in his palm. The small diamond reflected the ballroom lights. Claire remembered the day Ryan had given it to her. She remembered believing it symbolized a future. Now it felt like a relic from another life. Alexander held the ring toward her. "This belongs to you," he said quietly. Claire stared at it. For a second she could not move. Then she gently closed her fingers around the ring. The metal felt cold against her skin. "Thank you," she whispered. Alexander nodded. Before either of them could say more, a voice called from across the room. "Alexander Hayes?" The room instantly grew silent again. An older executive near the front looked stunned. "As in Hayes Capital?" Another guest gasped. Someone else lowered their phone and whispered something to a friend. Claire noticed the reaction immediately. Alexander's expression barely changed. Ryan, however, looked confused. "Hayes Capital?" he repeated. Then recognition hit him. The color drained from his face. Even Claire had heard the name before. Hayes Capital was one of the largest investment firms in the country. Financial magazines featured its founder constantly. Business networks discussed his acquisitions. Entrepreneurs dreamed of securing meetings with him. Claire slowly turned toward Alexander. "You own Hayes Capital?" she asked. He looked almost embarrassed by the attention. "Yes." The answer was simple. No arrogance. No performance. Just fact. Across the ballroom, the atmosphere shifted completely. People who had ignored Claire moments earlier were suddenly watching her with fascination. Ryan looked as though he had forgotten how to breathe. His startup had spent 2 years trying to attract investors connected to Alexander's network. Now the man himself was standing beside Claire. Reality seemed to arrive all at once. The whispers grew louder. Cameras continued recording. Alexander glanced at the growing crowd and then back at Claire. "You should not have to spend another minute here if you do not want to." Claire looked around the room. At the curious faces. At Ryan. At the shattered remains of a future she no longer wanted. Then she took a slow breath. For the first time that night, she felt something unexpected replacing the hurt. Not revenge. Not satisfaction. Freedom. And when she finally looked at Alexander, she found herself nodding. The moment Claire nodded, Alexander offered a small smile and guided her toward the ballroom exit. Nobody tried to stop them. The crowd parted almost automatically, creating a path through the sea of expensive suits and evening gowns. Claire could feel hundreds of eyes following her every step. A few hours earlier, she would have felt overwhelmed by the attention. Now she only felt exhausted. The cool Chicago night air greeted them as they stepped outside the hotel. The city lights reflected across the wet pavement from a brief evening rain. Traffic moved steadily along the avenue, while distant sirens echoed somewhere downtown. For the first time all night, Claire could breathe. She wrapped her arms around herself and stared across the street. Neither of them spoke for several seconds. The silence felt strangely comfortable. "Thank you," she finally said. Her voice was softer than she intended. Alexander slipped his hands into his coat pockets. You do not owe me thanks. Claire gave a faint laugh. I think I do. Most people would have walked away. Most people are afraid of uncomfortable moments. His answer came easily. I have learned that uncomfortable moments usually reveal who people really are. Claire looked at him. The city lights caught the edges of his face. For someone whose name apparently carried enormous weight, he seemed surprisingly ordinary. Calm, grounded, human. A black sedan pulled quietly to the curb beside them. The driver stepped out and opened the rear door. Claire immediately took a step back. I should go home, she said. Of course. Alexander nodded. Allow me to make sure you get there safely. Claire hesitated. Every instinct told her not to climb into a luxury vehicle with a man she had met less than an hour ago. But another part of her remembered the ballroom. The way he had stood beside her when nobody else would. The way he had never asked for anything in return. Slowly, she agreed. 20 minutes later, the sedan turned onto a quiet residential street on the north side of the city. Alexander glanced out the window. The neighborhood was modest. Small brick apartment buildings lined the block. Nothing flashy. Nothing glamorous. Claire noticed his expression. Not exactly the places you are used to visiting? She asked. Alexander looked back at her. You would be surprised. The car stopped outside a 3-story building. Claire reached for the door handle. Thank you again. Alexander nodded. Good night, Claire. She started to leave, then paused. Why did you help me? The question hung between them. Alexander looked out the windshield for a moment before answering. Because nobody should be treated the way you were tonight. Claire waited, sensing there was more. His gaze returned to hers. And because you never gave him the reaction he wanted. Something about that answer made her chest tighten. Before she could respond, her phone suddenly vibrated. Then again, and again. Notifications flooded the screen nonstop. Text messages. Social media alerts. Missed calls. Claire frowned and opened one of the messages from her friend Emily. Her eyes widened immediately. Attached was a video. The video. The entire ballroom scene. Ryan's speech. Alexander standing beside her. Millions of views were already climbing higher by the second. Claire looked up in shock. Alexander's phone began vibrating. At the exact same moment. Neither of them spoke. They simply stared at their screens as the reality settled in. What happened inside that ballroom was no longer private. By morning, the entire country would know their faces. Claire barely slept. Long after the black sedan disappeared from her street, she remained awake on the small couch in her apartment, staring at the glow of her phone. Every few seconds, another notification arrived. New messages, new tags, new comments. By 2 in the morning, the video had accumulated millions of views. By sunrise, several major media outlets had reposted it. Some called her the woman who had been publicly humiliated. Others focused on Alexander Hayes stepping into the middle of the drama. Few people seemed interested in the actual truth. The internet had already created its own version of events. Claire rubbed her tired eyes as morning sunlight filtered through her apartment window. Her phone rang again. This time it was her best friend Emily. The second Claire answered, Emily practically shouted through the speaker. Please tell me you know who that man is. Claire let out a tired laugh. Apparently the entire country knows who he is. Claire, that is Alexander Hayes. I figured that part out. No, I mean really Alexander Hayes. Billionaire. Investor. Magazine covers. Television interviews. People literally write books about that man. Claire glanced toward the kitchen. The conversation felt surreal. 24 hours earlier, she had been planning a wedding. Now she was the center of a viral story involving one of the most powerful businessmen in America. Trust me, she said quietly. I am just as confused as everyone else. After ending the call, she attempted to focus on normal life. She made coffee, checked emails, tried to answer concerned messages from family members. None of it helped. Everywhere she looked, she saw headlines discussing the ballroom incident. Around 10 o'clock, another notification appeared. This one was different. It was not from a friend. It was from Alexander. Claire stared at the screen for several seconds before opening the message. Good morning. I apologize for what your day is about to look like. That simple sentence made her smile despite herself. A second message followed. My office has been receiving calls from reporters since 5 o'clock. I suspect yours will be similar. Claire typed a reply. You predicted the future. My phone has not stopped ringing. 3 dots appeared almost instantly. Then another message arrived. Would you be willing to meet for lunch? There are some things we should discuss. Claire hesitated. Part of her wanted to avoid everything connected to the previous night. Another part knew that was impossible. The world had linked their names together already. Eventually, she responded with a simple yes. At exactly noon, a black sedan arrived outside her building. The same driver opened the rear door. Claire climbed inside, feeling every neighbor's eyes following her from behind curtains and apartment windows. 20 minutes later, the vehicle stopped in front of a modern glass tower overlooking the Chicago River. Claire stepped out and looked up. The building seemed to touch the clouds. Employees moved through the entrance carrying briefcases and coffee cups. Several greeted Alexander by name as he emerged from the lobby to meet her personally. Claire noticed something immediately. Despite his wealth and influence, he treated every employee exactly the same way. He knew names, asked questions, remembered details. As they entered the building together, Claire realized she was seeing a side of Alexander that no viral video could ever capture. And for the first time since the worst night of her life, curiosity began to replace heartbreak. The private elevator carried them more than 60 floors above the city. Claire stood quietly beside Alexander as the numbers climbed higher and higher. Through the glass wall behind them, Chicago stretched toward the horizon beneath a pale blue afternoon sky. Boats moved along the river like tiny toys. Traffic crawled through downtown streets far below. Everything looked distant, smaller somehow. When the elevator doors opened, Claire stepped into an office unlike anything she had ever seen. Floor-to-ceiling windows surrounded the space. Sunlight reflected across polished wood and steel. Shelves filled with books lined one wall. Framed photographs occupied another. There were no gold statues or extravagant displays of wealth. The room felt surprisingly personal. Alexander motioned toward a seating area near the windows. Lunch should arrive shortly. Claire sat down carefully. I expected something more intimidating. Alexander smiled. That might be the nicest thing anyone has said about my office. Before she could respond, a woman entered carrying a tablet. She appeared to be in her 40s, dressed professionally, with the confident posture of someone accustomed to managing chaos. The reporters have doubled since this morning, she announced before noticing Claire. Sorry, bad timing. Alexander stood. Claire, this is Margaret, my chief of staff. Margaret offered a warm smile. Nice to finally meet the woman responsible for breaking the internet. Claire laughed despite herself. Trust me, that was not part of my plan. Margaret's expression softened. From what I saw, you handled an impossible situation with more grace than most people ever could. After she left, lunch arrived. The conversation drifted away from viral videos and media attention. Alexander asked about Claire's work, her family, her interests. Unlike most successful people she had met through Ryan, he actually listened to the answers. When she mentioned volunteering at a neighborhood literacy program every Saturday, he seemed genuinely interested. When she talked about helping her younger brother pay college tuition, he remembered details later in the conversation. Hours passed more quickly than she expected. Eventually, Claire's attention drifted toward one of the photographs on the shelf behind him. It showed a much younger Alexander standing beside an older woman with bright eyes and a warm smile. Your mother? She asked. Alexander followed her gaze. The change in his expression was immediate. Subtle, but unmistakable. Yes. His voice softened. She raised me by herself. Claire waited. Something told her the story mattered. Alexander looked out the window toward the skyline. We did not have much when I was growing up. There were years when every dollar mattered. Claire blinked. That was not the answer she expected from a billionaire. Alexander gave a quiet laugh. Most people assume I was born into this. He gestured around the office. The truth is much less glamorous. For the next several minutes, he told her about working after school, helping his mother pay bills, and building his first company from a rented apartment barely larger than Claire's living room. There was no self-promotion in his voice, no attempt to impress her, just honesty. Claire found herself seeing him differently. Not as the billionaire from magazine covers, not as the stranger who had appeared during the worst night of her life, but as a man who understood struggle more than most people realized. And as the afternoon sunlight filled the office, she began to understand why success had never changed the kindness she had seen in him from the very beginning. Over the next week, something unexpected happened. The media storm refused to disappear. Every morning new articles appeared. Every afternoon, another television segment discussed the ballroom incident. Every evening social media found a new angle to analyze. Yet the story gradually shifted away from Ryan's betrayal and toward a different question. Who exactly was Claire Bennett? Claire found the attention uncomfortable. She still worked her normal job. She still bought groceries from the same neighborhood market. She still spent Saturdays helping children learn to read at the community literacy center. But now strangers recognized her. Some offered encouragement. Others asked for photographs. Life no longer felt entirely her own. One rainy Thursday afternoon, Claire arrived at the literacy center carrying a box of donated books. The familiar scent of paper and crayons greeted her as children raced between tables. It was the one place where the outside noise seemed unable to follow her. At least, that was what she thought until she heard a familiar voice near the entrance. I was told this was where I could find the most important person in Chicago. Claire turned and nearly dropped the books. Alexander stood in the doorway holding an umbrella. Several children immediately ran toward him, curious about the stranger in the expensive suit. Claire laughed. Important person? That is what I heard. His eyes carried the same warmth she remembered from the hotel. Before she could answer, a young boy tugged on Alexander's sleeve. Are you famous? The question caused several adults nearby to smile. Alexander crouched slightly to meet the boy's eye level. Not really. My mom says you are on television. Alexander considered that. Your mom is probably watching the wrong channels. The children burst into laughter. Claire found herself laughing too. What surprised her most was how natural Alexander seemed. Within minutes, he was helping stack books, listening to stories, and answering endless questions from curious 8-year-olds. There was no performance in it. No cameras. No reporters. Nobody important to impress. Yet he gave every child his full attention. Later that afternoon, as rain tapped softly against the windows, Claire watched him help a nervous little girl sound out difficult words from a chapter book. The girl smiled proudly after finishing a paragraph. Alexander smiled right back. Something shifted inside Claire. During the past week, she had learned about his wealth, his influence, and the empire he had built. But this moment revealed something more valuable. Character. The kind nobody could purchase. As the literacy session ended, the children reluctantly headed home. Claire and Alexander remained behind to organize books. The room felt unusually quiet. You are good with them, Claire said. Alexander placed a novel onto a shelf. My mother volunteered at places like this when I was young. His expression softened at the memory. She always said that helping one person matters even if you cannot help everyone. Claire smiled. She sounds wise. She usually was. Their eyes met briefly. Neither looked away immediately. Outside, the rain continued falling across the city. Inside, surrounded by books and fading afternoon light, Claire realized she was no longer thinking about the worst night of her life. For the first time in weeks, she was thinking about the possibility of something new. By the following Monday, life seemed almost calm. Again, almost. Claire returned to her normal routines while Alexander balanced meetings, interviews, and the endless demands of running Hayes Capital. They still exchanged messages throughout the day. Sometimes it was about work. Sometimes it was about a book a child had recommended at the literacy center. Sometimes it was nothing important at all. Yet those conversations slowly became the brightest part of Claire's day, which was why the phone call caught her completely off guard. She had just finished helping organize a charity fundraiser when Emily rushed toward her holding a tablet. Claire, she said breathlessly, you need to see this. Claire looked down. Her stomach immediately tightened. A headline stretched across the screen. Secret deal exposed? Sources claim ballroom romance was staged from the beginning. Beneath it were photographs. One showed Alexander helping Claire into the sedan outside her apartment. Another showed them entering his office building together. A third displayed a blurry image of a document. Claire felt her pulse quicken. What is this? Emily shook her head. It gets worse. The article claimed that Claire and Alexander had secretly arranged the ballroom incident to gain publicity. According to anonymous sources, their relationship was nothing more than a calculated business strategy. The blurry document was described as evidence of a financial agreement between them. Claire stared at the screen in disbelief. None of it was true. Not one word. Yet the article sounded convincing enough to make strangers believe it. Her phone immediately began vibrating. New messages flooded in. Some defended her. Others accused her of manipulating a wealthy man for attention and money. Within an hour, several other media outlets had repeated the story. By afternoon, the rumor had spread everywhere. Claire sat alone in her apartment that evening watching the storm unfold online. The comments hurt more than she wanted to admit. Gold digger, actress, opportunist. People who had never met her suddenly seemed certain they knew everything about her character. Around 7 o'clock, her phone rang. Alexander. She answered immediately. Have you seen it? He asked. His voice sounded unusually tense. Unfortunately, silence lingered for a moment. Then Alexander exhaled. The document is fake. I know. Someone deliberately created this. Claire walked toward her window. Outside, city lights flickered across the neighborhood. Who would do something like that? Another pause followed. This one felt heavier. I have a theory. Claire's grip tightened around the phone. She already knew the answer before he said it. Ryan. Alexander did not respond immediately. My team traced the first release to a public relations firm connected to one of his investors. Claire closed her eyes. Disappointment washed through her. Even after everything, Ryan still could not let go. He had already taken enough from her. Now he wanted to destroy the one good thing that had entered her life afterward. Claire, Alexander said quietly. Listen to me. This will pass. She wanted to believe him. She truly did. But as another wave of notifications lit up her screen, she realized something had changed. For the first time since the ballroom, the outside world was no longer attacking her alone. Now it was attacking whatever was beginning to grow between them. The following week felt like walking through a storm that refused to end. Everywhere Claire went, the rumors followed. At the grocery store, strangers glanced at her phone screen and whispered. At the literacy center, a few parents looked at her differently. Most people were kind, but doubt had a way of spreading faster than truth. Late Friday afternoon, Claire sat alone on a bench overlooking Lake Michigan. Gray clouds drifted across the horizon while waves rolled against the shoreline. Her phone rested beside her, silent for the first time all day. She should have felt relieved. Instead, she felt tired. Deeply tired. The kind of exhaustion that came from constantly defending yourself against things you never did. A familiar voice broke the silence. I had a feeling I would find you here. Claire looked up. Alexander stood a few feet away holding 2 cups of coffee. She accepted one with a faint smile. Your security team tracking my location now? Alexander sat beside her. No. Emily told Margaret. Margaret told me. Claire laughed softly. That sounds more believable. For several minutes, they watched the water without speaking. The city skyline shimmered in the distance. Sailboats moved slowly across the lake. It should have been peaceful. Instead, tension lingered between them. Not because either of them was angry, because both were carrying the weight of everything happening around them. Finally, Claire spoke. Maybe Ryan got what he wanted. Alexander turned toward her immediately. What does that mean? She stared at the waves. Before all of this, my life was simple. Not perfect, but simple. Her voice remained steady. Now every decision feels connected to a headline. Every conversation becomes speculation. Every good thing gets questioned. Alexander listened without interrupting. Claire, maybe it would be easier if people stopped seeing us together. The words hurt the moment she said them. The silence that followed felt heavier than anything before it. Alexander looked away toward the horizon. His expression remained calm, but something changed in his eyes. Something guarded. Is that what you want? He asked quietly. Claire opened her mouth. Nothing came out. Because the honest answer was no. She did not want distance. She did not want fewer conversations. She did not want to lose the part of her life that had slowly become the brightest. But wanting something and protecting it were not always the same thing. I do not know, she admitted. Alexander nodded slowly. The answer seemed to confirm something he already feared. He stared at the coffee cup in his hands before speaking again. Years ago, someone I cared about stayed with me because of what I could provide. His voice was calm, almost detached. When that ended, I promised myself I would never put another person through the consequences of my world. Claire looked at him. This was the first time he had mentioned anything resembling a past relationship. Alexander, he stood before she could finish. Maybe some distance is exactly what we need right now. The words landed harder than she expected. Not because they were cruel, because they sounded sincere, necessary, reasonable, and that made them impossible to argue against. A cold wind swept across the lake. Alexander offered a small smile that never quite reached his eyes. Then he turned and walked toward the parking lot. Claire remained on the bench long after he disappeared from view. As the sun slowly dipped behind the Chicago skyline, she realized that losing Ryan had hurt. But watching Alexander walk away felt entirely different. Because this time, she was losing someone she had never expected to find. 3 weeks passed. Chicago moved forward as it always did, indifferent to broken hearts and unfinished conversations. The rumors eventually slowed, replaced by newer scandals and fresher headlines. Yet the silence between Claire and Alexander remained. They no longer exchanged daily messages. They no longer shared coffee by the lake or conversations that stretched late into the evening. Claire told herself it was for the best. Some days, she almost believed it. On a chilly Tuesday morning, she arrived at the literacy center carrying a stack of donated books. The children greeted her with their usual excitement, but she noticed something different waiting near the entrance. A television crew, 2 reporters, several unfamiliar faces holding cameras. Claire stopped walking. Her stomach tightened instantly. Emily hurried toward her. "I know exactly what you are thinking," she said. "But this time, it is not bad." Before Claire could ask what was happening, Margaret stepped through the doorway. The sight surprised her. She had not seen Alexander's chief of staff since their lunch at Hayes Capital. Margaret smiled warmly. "Good morning, Claire." "Margaret." Claire looked around the room. "What is all this?" Margaret handed her a small envelope. "You should probably read this first." Claire carefully opened it. Inside was a handwritten note. She recognized the handwriting immediately. "Some stories deserve the truth. Meet me at 7 tonight." The address was written beneath the message. Claire stared at the note for several seconds. Her heart began beating faster. "What is going on?" Margaret's smile widened. "You will find out tonight." The entire day felt endless. By evening, Claire found herself standing outside an old historic building near downtown Chicago. The address led to a restored theater she had never visited before. Soft lights illuminated the entrance. A small crowd gathered outside. Reporters stood behind barriers. Guests dressed in formal attire moved through the doors. Confusion followed her every step. Inside, the theater looked magnificent. Velvet seats stretched across the auditorium. Crystal chandeliers glowed overhead. A large stage waited beneath a curtain of golden light. An usher guided her toward the front row. "This seat is reserved for you." Claire sat down slowly. The room continued filling with people. Business leaders, community volunteers, teachers from the literacy center, families she recognized. Even several children she had helped tutor were present. Then the lights dimmed. The crowd grew quiet. Claire's pulse quickened. The curtain slowly opened. A giant screen illuminated the stage. Images appeared one after another. Children reading books. Community centers receiving funding. Neighborhood programs helping families. Literacy initiatives expanding across the city. Claire recognized many of them. She had volunteered at several herself. Then a voice filled the theater. Alexander's voice. "A city becomes stronger when ordinary people choose kindness even when nobody is watching." Claire froze. The audience listened in silence. More images appeared. Then one photograph stopped her breath completely. It showed her reading with a young student at the literacy center. Another followed. Then another. Every image highlighted moments she never expected anyone to notice. The crowd watched quietly while tears filled Claire's eyes. She finally understood. This was not about repairing a reputation. It was not about headlines. Somewhere behind that curtain, Alexander had spent weeks preparing something far more meaningful. And for the first time since he walked away beside Lake Michigan, hope returned. Claire sat motionless as the images continued appearing across the giant screen. Photographs from literacy programs, community events, volunteer drives, small moments that most people would have forgotten. Yet someone had remembered all of them. Someone had taken the time to show an entire theater that kindness rarely arrives with cameras or applause. The audience watched in silence. Then Alexander's voice returned. "The world often celebrates people with power. But real change usually begins with people who never expect recognition." Claire felt tears gathering in her eyes. More images appeared. One showed her carrying boxes of donated books through the rain. Another showed her helping a young student prepare for a reading competition. Another captured her sitting beside an elderly volunteer after everyone else had gone home. She remembered every moment. None of them had felt extraordinary at the time. They had simply felt right. The screen faded to black. For a brief second, the theater remained completely silent. Then the curtain slowly opened. Alexander stood alone beneath a warm spotlight. He wore a dark suit, but there was nothing intimidating about him now. No billionaire headlines. No business magazine covers. Just a man holding a microphone and looking directly toward the front row. Toward Claire. The audience immediately applauded. Alexander waited patiently until the room quieted again. Several months ago, he began. Millions of people watched a video and formed opinions about someone they had never met. The crowd listened carefully. Some called her a victim. Some called her lucky. Others believed rumors created by people who wanted attention. Claire lowered her eyes briefly. She knew exactly what he was talking about. Alexander continued. What most people never saw were the things that happened when nobody was watching. The giant screen behind him illuminated again. This time, names and testimonials appeared. Parents from the literacy center. Teachers. Volunteers. Families she had helped. One by one, they shared stories about Claire's generosity, patience, and character. The room grew emotional. Even reporters seated near the back seemed captivated. Then Alexander looked directly toward the audience. There is something else everyone deserves to know. The atmosphere shifted. Anticipation spread through the theater. The article, claiming Claire and I created a publicity scheme, was completely false. Murmurs moved through the crowd. Alexander remained calm. Last week, my legal team completed an investigation. The documents used to support those claims were fabricated. A large screen displayed official findings and statements. Evidence. Timelines. Verification. Facts. The truth unfolded piece by piece. Claire felt her heart racing. Finally, the lies that had haunted her for weeks were being dismantled publicly. Then came the final revelation. The investigation directly connected the false campaign to individuals working on behalf of Ryan's business interests. Gasps echoed throughout the theater. The room absorbed the information in stunned silence. Alexander never mentioned revenge. He never insulted anyone. He simply presented the truth. And somehow that made the moment even more powerful. When the presentation ended, the audience rose to its feet. Applause thundered through the theater. Claire sat frozen, overwhelmed by emotion. Slowly, Alexander stepped down from the stage and walked toward her. The crowd remained standing. The applause continued. He stopped directly in front of her seat. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then Alexander reached into his pocket and carefully removed a small velvet box. Claire recognized it instantly. Her breath caught. It was not a new ring. It was the engagement ring he had picked up from the ballroom floor on the worst night of her life. Alexander gently placed the box in her hands. This belonged to a chapter that should have ended differently, he said softly. But it never defined your worth. Around them, the theater had become completely silent once again. Every eye was focused on the two of them. And Claire suddenly realized this night was not ending with the past. It was making room for the future. Claire stared at the velvet box resting in her hands while emotion tightened her throat. The old engagement ring sat inside exactly where Alexander had placed it months earlier after picking it up from the ballroom floor. The symbol of a future that had collapsed. A reminder of a night she once wished she could erase. Yet standing in the theater surrounded by hundreds of people, Claire realized something remarkable. She no longer felt pain when she looked at it. She felt gratitude. Because every difficult moment had led her here. Alexander remained standing before her. The audience watched in complete silence. Slowly, Claire closed the box and looked up at him. Her eyes glistened beneath the theater lights. Alexander smiled softly. Then he reached into his jacket pocket once more. This time, the room seemed to stop breathing. Claire's heart skipped. Alexander opened a second velvet box. Inside rested a simple, elegant ring. Nothing extravagant. Nothing designed to impress headlines. It was beautiful because of what it represented. Not wealth. Not status. Choice. Months ago, Alexander said quietly, his voice carrying through the silent theater, I stepped into a ballroom because I could not stand watching someone be treated unfairly. Claire felt tears spill down her cheeks. Alexander continued, what I never expected was to meet a woman who would change the way I look at the world. The audience listened without moving. You reminded me that kindness still matters. That integrity still matters. That character matters more than success ever will. Claire lowered her eyes briefly, overwhelmed. Alexander took a slow breath. The first time I stood beside you, I wanted to help you through the worst night of your life. Since then, every day with you has become one of the best parts of mine. A few people in the audience wiped away tears. Even Margaret was smiling through watery eyes. Alexander lowered himself onto one knee. A collective gasp swept through the theater. Claire covered her mouth. Her heart pounded so loudly she could barely hear anything else. "Claire Bennett," he said gently, "you never needed someone to rescue you. You were strong long before I met you. You were kind long before anyone noticed. And you were extraordinary long before the world learned your name." His eyes never left hers. "But if you will let me, I would love the privilege of spending the rest of my life beside you." The theater disappeared around her. The crowd, the lights, the cameras, none of it mattered. All Claire saw was the man who had stood beside her when she felt alone. The man who had defended her without expecting anything in return. The man who had shown her that love was not about grand promises. It was about consistent actions. She nodded before she could even speak. Then she laughed through her tears. "Yes," she whispered. The audience erupted into applause. Cheers filled the theater. Alexander slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to his feet. Claire immediately wrapped her arms around him. The crowd continued celebrating as the giant screen behind them illuminated one final image. A photograph taken earlier that week at the Literacy Center. Claire reading with children. Alexander sitting nearby helping a young student sound out difficult words. Two ordinary people sharing an ordinary moment. Somehow that image felt more meaningful than any headline ever could. 1 year later, the literacy program expanded into 3 additional neighborhoods through a partnership between community volunteers and the Hayes Foundation. Thousands of children gained access to books and tutoring resources. Claire continued leading the work she loved. Alexander remained her biggest supporter. And on a warm spring evening in Chicago, surrounded by family, friends, and many smiling children, they were married. As the sun set behind the city skyline, Claire glanced at the ring on her finger and remembered the old one she once believed defined her future. She had been wrong. The future was never about a ring. It was about finding someone who saw her value long before the rest of the world did. And that made all the difference.